Hi, this is Don Wibier from DevExpress. In this video I'll teach you some advanced techniques of the DevExtreme data grid. For this I've already set up a new project by using the DevExtreme project template using material design, and inside Visual Studio I've already put together a project which has an entity framework model scaffolded from the database. It also has a number of DTO models in place, and to perform the DTO, the data transformation object design pattern, I am using AutoMap, and I have already configured an AutoMapper profile which will do all the mapping while running the application. Let's first start by implementing the invoice grid on one of the pages. And for that, the data grid will connect to a web API endpoint, which I've already coded here as well. And the API will allow us to perform gets. It allows us to perform posts, puts, and deletes, all by using DTO and using AutoMapper in combination with Entity Framework. Let's start by opening up the invoice razor file. Let's start by inserting a DevExtreme data grid in the page. This is done by our extension method DataGrid. As you can see, I am using the generic variant, so I can strongly type the model being configured inside the data grid. The next thing I will do is I will configure the data grid to connect directly to a web API endpoint by using this approach. I'll specify the controller name, the load action, insert action, put action, the delete action, and most important, the key which holds the key field name of the entity being worked on. If I check the invoice controller, what you'll see is that we have the invoice controller here. It has a get, it has a post, it has a put, and it has a delete. The next thing I will do is I'll configure a number of extra options on the data grid, and that is going to be the following. I will enable the filtering. I will enable sorting as well, and I will allow remote operations. That means that paging, sorting, grouping and filtering is being performed on the server instead of on the client, and this is very convenient when using large data sets. Another thing that I'll configure is the pager. I want to have a pager on the grid with the following page sizes. The last thing I will configure is the columns. And this is done by calling another extension method on the Fluent API, which looks as follows. In this case, I will add the invoice ID, the invoice date, the is corporate boolean property, and a customer ID. But do note that I configure the column type to be a lookup column type. And because a lookup column type needs data to display, I will configure a data source in a similar way by specifying a controller name and the load action for the lookup values. And again, I'll specify the primary key field name of this particular data set. With the configuration of the lookup, I'll configure the value expression, which is going to be returned, and a display expression, which will hold the customer name. Last two columns I'll configure is the total amount and the item count of the invoice. And when I run the application, what we'll see is a data grid populated with all the invoices inside the database. And what you can also see is that the sorting has been enabled. I could put it ascending as well, or I could even filter specific columns like this. And as I mentioned, this is all being performed on the server, so small data sets are being returned here. Let's go to the next feature, and that is I want to create a report displaying the invoices. And I want to do this in a way that I can either select a number of invoices and create one report with all the invoices, or I can select an individual one. For this, I have already set up a report. The report is inside this folder, and it is already configured properly to be bound to the DTO invoice. This is what it looks like, and let's set this functionality up. For this, I will need to enable the selection feature of the data grid, and I want to select multiple options here. So I'll do that by specifying the following method in the configuration. I'll specify selection is selection mode multiple. The next thing I want to do is I want to add an extra column which will show a reporting button, so I can click an individual record, and by using the multi-select feature I will need to add a button to the toolbar of the data grid. And for this I will need a couple of things. Let's first start by adding this button to the toolbar. We do this by executing some JavaScript at runtime, and in this case I will trigger the onToolbar preparing, and that will execute my own main grid toolbar preparing function. This function will be added at the bottom of this page, and this is done by inserting the following code. This event receives an argument, and it will have a toolbar options items where I will add a button. This button will execute the open report function, which allows us to select to open up the report with all the items included that were selected in the data grid. Another thing that we need to do is we need to keep track of all the items being selected, and for that I will add a form with a hidden field like this, which will hold the selected reporting IDs. And another function that we'll need is the open report. The open report looks like this. And this function is the one being called when you click the button. What's happening is I will request that hidden form field. I'll get all the IDs and I submit that form to the reporting engine. Whenever that ID is empty, I'll give an alert with no invoices selected. With this in place, we are ready to run the application and see what we have changed so far. If I go to the invoices page, what we'll see is a small button on top, which has been added by coding in the JavaScript function. Another thing that has changed is that we have a select checkbox column here. And if I hover over, I can select randomly the invoices that I want. And if I now hit this button, what we'll see is that the report designer will process the reports. And in this case we have 8 items selected, and as you can see we also have 8 pages which we can browse through. We can also add a column to the data grid to allow us to preview individual records. And we do this by switching back to Visual Studio, and in the grid configuration I'll add the following code. For this I will add a column which is bound to the invoice ID, and I will give it a name inv ID. What I'll do next, I'll specify a width of this column. I allow filtering to be disabled, and also sorting will be disabled on this column. And next I will use a cell template by using this construct, which is a razor fragment. And next I will insert a button with an icon specified, and I will not use the submit behavior because I don't want this form to be submitted, but the onClick calls the open report together with the value, and the value is the value of the cell which was bound to this column. I will also make sure that nothing happens any further. If I execute if I run the application again, what you'll see is that we now have an additional column on the data grid which allows us to open up a report of an individual record directly. Let's change the appearance of the pop-up editor. In this case, what I'll do is I'll get back to Visual Studio, and inside the editing option I will specify another configuration setting. This is the form method, and the form method allows me to influence the elements being displayed and also the way that they are being displayed. In this case I will add a group inside the form with a call span of 2 and a column count of 3. And next I will add a simple editor for the invoice, and I will add a simple editor for the date as well as the customer ID. Once I now run the application, what you'll see is that the editor has been changed, but I will change it a bit more. As you can see, there are now 3 elements next to each other and a big empty space. The first thing I'd like to change is the appearance of the customers. I want to have a data grid dropping down so I can see whether it is a customer, a corporate customer, or a private user. So for this I will get back to Visual Studio and change a couple of more things here. I'll go back to Visual Studio and I'm gonna configure a specific setting on the customer column. For this I will go back to the customer ID column in the grid, and I will add a specification to it which allows us to load a template. In this case I will use the Fluent API to specify that a drop-down box template will be used. And how does this work? Well, I can go down to the page, and right here I can specify, I can insert that template. The template will look like the following. I will configure it to be a drop-down control. I will again configure the data source to connect to the correct web API and action method here. And I will specify a couple of things. For instance, the value, and again the value expression, the display expression, and a couple of other things. One of the other things I specify is the content template which will be used for this particular control. And this content template will look like the following code. This will insert a DevExtreme data grid to display the company of the customer, the last name and the first name. I'll specify a number of options that come with the data grid, but most important, I also trigger a number of JavaScript events here, like the onSelection changed, to make sure that everything is passed through to the data grid correctly. For this, I will need to include some JavaScript in my script section, and this is something which looks like this. I will get the selected row and I will get the selected value of that customer, and I will synchronize the data grid that shows the customer. And because I have configured this on a column base and not on a particular form editing control, you will see that this is also being used when browsing the application. So if I run the application right now, what we'll see is the same data grid together with the pop-up, but with a data grid instead of a single column drop-down. The last thing I'll show you is how to display the invoice items in this particular pop-up. Let's get back to Visual Studio and configure something inside the form collection of the pop-up editor. I'll do this by going back to this particular section and insert the following code. I'll insert another item with a group. I'll give it a name, invoice items, and for this I will also use a template, the invoice item template. So whenever this pop-up opens up, it will render this particular template. The template I will need to insert in the page as well, and the template will look like this. In this case, I use the correct name and I will insert another data grid, but now with the DTO invoice line model specified. In this case, I will also specify a different controller, and I will only do a get together with the invoice line ID. A very important thing in this particular fetch is that I need to specify a load parameter to specify that only the items of the selected invoice are being selected. And this is done by using the load params function with an invoice ID specified like this. Because there is a JavaScript construct being used here, we need to configure some additional JavaScript as well. The first thing we'll do is we need to initialize the detail grid, and that method looks like this. I'll specify a reference to the current detail grid so we can access this for other functionality as well. Another thing we need to add is we need, whenever the main grid starts editing, we need to know the selected ID. And this is done with the following method. And this method needs to be configured in the main grid. So we'll scroll up to the main grid, and right here we can edit, we can specify this particular event. And with this in place, when we open one of the records for editing, we'll see that the items are loaded properly as well. And that's it for this video. I hope you were able to get a better understanding of our DevExtreme controls. You can learn more by watching the videos from this playlist or checking out our documentation. Thanks for watching.